Welcome back. It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below.
Hello, please. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And in this video, we take a look at the extremely controversial undercover operation, simply known as Operation Century. It was this operation against Michael Steele during the investigation of the Rettendon murders, which came to light during the trial of Michael Steele and Jack Wombs. We will also hear from a man by the name of Ian Cameron, someone who has spent many years researching this undercover operation and who has had personal contact in prison with Michael Steele, who has been able to give him a great insight into exactly how this operation unfolded. Firstly, let's give you a brief oversight of the operation itself, and at the end of the video I will give you my own thoughts and feelings. Operation Century was the code name for a sting operation by Essex police investigating the Rettendon murders of 3 violent drug dealers that happened in Rettendon Essex in December 1995. It was assisted by RUC Special Branch officers, and the purpose of the operation was to bring pressure to bear on persons who they suspected to have knowledge to disclose about the triple murder in order to incriminate the suspects in question or others. The operation itself produced no arrests or evidence leading to a criminal prosecution. A prosecution that was eventually brought in connection with the Rettendon triple killings was wholly based on police operations subsequent to the abandonment and closure of Operation Century. The tactics deployed by Essex and Royal Ulster Constabulary Special Branch while Operation Century was underway increasingly led police to voicing serious threats against the suspects in question. The operation was also carefully timed to coincide with the 1996 Docklands bombing of Canary Wharf on the evening of February the 9th. One of the Essex suspects, Michael Steele, received a call from Belfast within minutes of the Canary Wharf explosion. The Rettendon triple murders had absolutely no Irish connection in themselves or with the bombing. Irish affairs were introduced solely by the police as part of the underlying leverage for their undercover operation. Transcripts of these phone calls became available, and police eventually had to acknowledge that they were made by Belfast-based Special Branch officers. These calls were repeatedly made to the Essex suspects from Ireland by RUC Special Branch, posing as Republican drug runners Irish Billy and Irish John. They were making it clear that they could rely upon organisational backup and additionally claiming that they had funded the criminal activities of one of the Rettendon murder victims, Pat Tate. The operation itself was put into place in order to gain intelligence and information against Michael Steele and his potential connection to the Rettendon murders. What I will now read to you is from a man by the name of Ian Cameron, a man who has spent many years researching this undercover operation, and the words that you hear next will be from him. Let's start from the very top. On the morning of the 7th of December 1995, police were called to a farmland country track at Rettendon in Essex. 3 men in a Range Rover had been found shot dead at point blank range. the Rettendon triple murder investigations had begun. In early February 1996, the police mounted an undercover operation codenamed Operation Century, which was principally targeted at two particular suspects, although others close to them, both family and friends, were naturally affected. Essex police claim to take pride in operating a public policing policy which specifically sets down on paper how they would treat those regarding as suspects in criminal investigations by fully taking into account their basic human rights. Essex police claim that Operation Century was properly authorised and fully in keeping with its commitment to the very highest standards of policing. Among the matters at issue are not so much whether Operation Century had been authorised, but that even if it was, the actions of the police breached the criminal law by using tactics that went far beyond what should have been properly authorised. The officer running the operation very well knew that he was sailing very, very close to the wind in regard of legality. The police, however, claim that their actions were legal. This report strongly insists otherwise. The police are still covering up the truth and are not facing up to the full facts. During Operation Century, police officers role-played as Belfast-based IRA terrorists. The tactics used were clearly intended to convey to the suspects referred to above that their lives were directly threatened by them, the IRA, and others in their organisation. Although it seemed in reality that the police did not intend to kill them, they wanted them to believe that the threats were real, that they were quite capable of carrying them out, and they would be carried out if necessary. This report, We're Breaking New Ground, takes its title from Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who later publicly bragged of being behind Operation Century and stated that from day one he had never had any intention of questioning the Century suspects in the normal manner. It looks at the cover-up that has taken place, and when their assistance has been sought, the role of the Home Office and others in making life much more difficult rather than supporting the need to bring Essex Police to proper account for Operation Century. Chapter 2. The Rettendon Triple Murder Trial. On the 20th of January 1998, at the end of an Old Bailey trial lasting over 4 months, two men, Michael Steele and Jack Womes, were convicted of the Rettendon murders. Both went down protesting their innocence, as they still do to this day. Although this report isn't about their trial as such, insofar as it resulted in their convictions, it does have to be paid some attention. One most basic reason for this is that since February 1998, when I first began to take up with the police and Home Office the human rights abuses connected with Operation Century, the head office has avoided responding to the obvious, which is that Operation Century abuses were abuses when they actually occurred, February 1996. And instead they have wheeled out the excuse that the Rettendon trial itself had disposed of the matter. It is obvious that they hoped the excuse would be publicly reassuring. Michael Steele was one of the two Century suspects. The other was Miss Sarah Saunders, the mother of a young child whose father, Patrick Tate, had been one of the murder victims. The fact that the human rights of Saunders, Steele, or anyone at all should have been abused as they were during Operation Century, regardless of whether there had been any subsequent charges or criminal proceedings, as none were which incriminated Saunders, hasn't been taken on board. Instead, the police and Home Office have hoped to fog the issue by contending that the Rettendon trial proceedings absolved the police from the accusation that Steele and Saunders' human rights had been criminally abused. One fact which has not been disputed is that neither the police or the prosecution gained any evidence through Operation Century to support their Rettendon prosecution. The police gained no incriminating evidence from Century, and the operation was short-lived and abandoned. It only featured in the Rettendon trial because Michael Steele raised it as part of his defence to show how ruthless and unprincipled the police were in their determination to bring a case against him. Steele has told me that there had previously been a police vendetta against him and he had formally complained, but to no effect. The police and Home Office claim that at trial, Operation Century was considered open and thorough, and was made transparent to both judge, jury and counsel. This report will indicate that in crucially important respects Operation Sentry was not made transparent and still hasn't been. I understand from Michael Steele that he had hoped the case against him would have been dropped when the court learnt of the terror tactics deployed during Operation Sentry, but quite simply, that never happened. It would have taken an exceptionally strong-minded judge to have ruled in Steele's favour, given the nature of the charges brought against him. In any case, as we shall see, not a single police officer who gave evidence would admit to being able to answer fully for Operation Sentry. Officers who could have helped, including officer then in charge of the case, Detective Superintendent Brian Story, were totally transparent in one thing: their absence from the witness stand. Chapter 3. The Press. During the first year in which I took up investigation into Operation Sentry with the police and head office, etc., all I had to go on to make progress were press reports and information from direct contact with one or two journalists. At times this information was slight, but still telling. One journalist still spoke in shocked tones on recounting the heavy manners of the undercover police in voicing their most vociferous threats against Steele. Steele had captured the most violent threats he received on tape and played the tape in court. It wasn't until the spring of '99, when from sheer exasperation and disbelief at the responses and treatment I was getting from authorities, including my local MP Kate Hoey, that I established contact with Michael Steele, whom I did not know previously. The start of the Rettendon trial was bloodbathed into oblivion by coinciding with the death of Princess Diana. As far as I am aware, there were no Rettendon trial reports afterwards either. Not until the jury brought in its verdict and sentences were handed down, when of course all the national newspapers ran it. With the exception of only one newspaper, none of this coverage reported Operation Sentry in intelligible terms. For instance, the Times did the next best thing by burying it in about 50 words. People know as much about Operation Sentry today as they do about something that hasn't happened and is never likely to. Reproduced on D2 of this report is a news report about Operation Sentry. It is from the newspaper The Sun. It is the only national press report that has ever appeared. It was this report that shocked and alerted me. I've been reading crime, police and associated news with a lot of commitment over many years and could not recall anything quite like Operation Sentry. For reasons I won't enter into here, I was genuinely reluctant to take up Sentry, but after thinking it over for some weeks, I thought somebody should. I contacted the Sun reporter, and there were teething problems. My letters didn't seem to get to whom they were addressed, but eventually he responded when I treated him to a sight of a letter from the chair of Essex Police Authority, which cast doubt on his Sentry report. The Sun man, who was not a happy bunny, stressed that he did not want to get involved in any campaign, but did release to me a longer Sentry text he had submitted for publication, which the Sun report had been produced from. This text is very interesting. John Burrow, the Essex Chief Constable, since retired, wrote off the Sun report as being unreliable, but the Sun text shows that the Sun report was in fact kind to the police by greatly toning down the police threats. I believed then, and still do now, that the Sun reporter had some serious genuine misgivings about Operation Sentry. This seems plain from his having tagged it as a bizarre plot. He is not saying that the police were clever, but a touch unlucky. He is saying that their actions were simply bizarre. More light will be shed on this as we continue. The local press. I'd heard by February that there'd been much more coverage in the local Essex press, and one or two people who promised to send me their newspaper copies never put their money where their mouths were. Disappointing, though not especially surprising, I managed to get down to Essex and copy up the bulk of the daily Rettendon trial coverage which had appeared in the Basildon Evening Echo. The Echo carried many reports which certainly shed more light on Operation Sentry and the extent to which it had been fully gone into at trial. It was clear that it had not been. It was also clear that Steele had alleged that death threats had been made against him by undercover officers. It was also clear that Sarah Saunders had been terrified by this experience. Although I also knew this from the details included in the Sun publication, the main prosecution witness Darren Nichols had also testified to being aware at first hand from his friendship and close association with Steele of the undercover threats being made against Steele. Steele, according to Nichols, was becoming increasingly stressed by these phone calls. Nichols had also apparently dropped an amazing clanger by suggesting in witness statements that the threats had predated the Rettendon murders, as part of a rationale for and build-up to them. Though this latter claim is obviously nonsense, there is no doubting that Nichols did know about the Century threats. It was also clear from their echo that at the end of the trial a basic contradiction remained, and the echo drew attention to it. On the one hand, a senior officer who did not admit to being directly involved in Operation Century testified that Century officers were not authorised to make threats to kill. The question was put to him fairly and squarely. When Steele's death threat tapes were played as part of his defence in court, the echo quoted directly from it. The star of Operation Century was none other than Detective Ivan Dibley. He retired in April 1996, having completed 32 years police service. A month or so after his Operation Century had been abandoned, it was Dibley who reportedly claimed when discussing with the Sun reporter how Operation Century as a tactic might be regarded as breaking new ground. The Justice Report, entitled Under Surveillance, Covert Policing and Human Rights Standards 1998, showed how open to systematic widespread abuse the systems of investigation, control and regulation are in relation to covert policing operations. The Association of Chief Police Officers Regulatory National Guidelines were secret. I requested the Home Office to provide an indication of the form of words that could authorise undercover officers to make overt threats against suspects' lives, and of course this has been one of the specific points which the Home Office has since been unwilling to respond to. It's not hard to guess why. Because police officers don't have any covert authority to threaten suspects' lives as they did in Operation Century. Even in extreme circumstances, that much of a realistic scenario isn't on offer to police officers. It is also written that the authorised plan of action permitted undercover officers to convey a realistic scenario without the threats being made against any individual. And this suggests, if truly indicative, that his fake covert IRA terror operation was always set to sail close to the wind. It would have been extremely instructive to have been a fly on the wall when Dibley, Burrow, Billy and John, the officers who role-played as IRA, were plotting Century. This report has claimed that Century was not made transparent to the trial process. Here are some points based on detailed information provided by Michael Steele, which have a bearing on the regulatory and supervisory assurances trotted out by Burrow and the Home Office officials. Firstly, the two undercover officers who made phone calls to Sarah Saunders and Michael Steele from Belfast began by pre-recording the date, time and the name of the operation. They also recorded where they were calling from, whom they were calling and their alias. They did not record their proper names, their ranks or where they were based, and as noted, these officers did not attend the Rettendon trial. Transcripts of all calls recorded by these police omit their names, and to this day their names are still being withheld. It is hard to fathom any reason which would go to their credit for this, and easy to see why the police might want to retain anonymity, if that would help to keep them out of trouble. According to the Sun report, these officers were probably RUC Special Branch. Secondly, the first two phone conversations between Steele and these undercover officers took place on the 8th of February 1996. Steele alleges that these officers propositioned him to participate in a criminal conspiracy to do with drugs trafficking, which he firmly rejected. At this rejection, on that very first day, threats were made. They vowed to carry out their threats by crossing to the mainland and coming to where he lived. Neither of these calls are in transcript form. The police claim that they weren't recorded. A very curious way to start a well-planned operation that was being actioned at the very highest levels throughout. Steele believes that these police failures are explained by the fact that recordings would be too incriminating. More calls were made the next day. These calls were recorded and transcribed. They make it plain that calls had taken place the previous day and the police threats had surfaced. February the 26th, 1996 was an important date for Operation Century. The undercover officers had previously been leaving answer phone messages for Sarah Saunders to contact them. She had been staying elsewhere. And that evening she finally called them back and spoke to Billy. She informed him she was worried for her 2-year-old child's safety. Billy was going to fucking sort things out one way or another for his firm. This call was recorded by the police. This officer later phoned Steele, his manner belligerent and pre-planned from the outset. Quote, "We were talking to that fucking girl today. Fucking Sarah. The call being referred to here is the one regarding the death threats and the car bomb." There were 2 calls that night to Steele. Neither, according to the police, were recorded. We are fortunate, however, that Steele did their work for them. As with the initial 8th of February calls, Steele believes the 26th of February calls are missing because they are too incriminating. Either way, this operation was hardly being properly conducted or supervised. The police still have some answering to do. As the calls drag embarrassingly on, it's obvious that we, Billy and John, have lost the plot. But like Lizzie James, they don't want to face it, cut their losses and call it a day. This is very surprising, because the bulk, if not all, nod nod wink wink of their calls have been recorded by them, and sitting in their bunker with Dibley or whoever, wherever, listening to the playbacks, they should have realised what a shambolic situation they'd all embroiled themselves in. Billy and John's fallback position, when as so often happened matters became very difficult because Michael Steele clearly wasn't playing ball and his obvious counter questions which they couldn't begin to answer began to become a real pain in their arse. The fallback position was to make threats, make it clear that the organisation would strike back, that we, Billy and John, would also strike back, that there'd be no escaping. You'll have to immigrate. Sooner or later things would come on top. The more extreme comrades were becoming impatient. There was a coded refrain that came up again and again and again. And what it signified was, quote, "Look, if you don't start taking us fucking seriously, you'll be fucking dealt with." It took the form of, quote, "I did tell you, Mickey," or similar, not in itself on the face of it violent, threatening language, but signifying that threats had already surfaced, were already there, or always in the background. Bear in mind that Steele wasn't passive. He was often interjecting with his own questions, inquiries, rebuttals and total denials. And when Billy or John were stumped, they fell back on their threats, and often didn't make all the headway that they may have wanted to. Steele would often interject to put another point across which flummoxed and deflected them yet again. The characteristic process I have described can be best seen at work in the most threatening call put through to Steele on the 26th of February. The call which Steele managed to tape. By this time, Steele had clearly had enough of it. Previously, for the most part, he had kept his cool and not allowed himself to be provoked. But during the call mentioned above, he argued back and ridiculed his caller from sheer exasperation. And as you can see, the undercover threats against him become ever more violent and foul-mouthed. The officer who made this call, Billy, had clearly planned to come across as belligerent, foul-mouthed and threatening from his very first words, from the very outset. There is the real possibility that he lost control, which aside from having behaved criminally, begs other questions. Of course, there was much more detail to the undercover calls than I have included above, but for the purposes of this report, it is not necessary to recount that level of detail. It was essentially a crass operation and never had a catch chance in hell of working and backfiring like an old banger. Given the serious accusations which I had made in all my letters to Burrow, he tried to absolve the police by asserting that his officers could not have been expected to know how Steele or Saunders would be affected by the tactics. Using precisely the same wording the Home Office used in April 1998, it has been claimed that all conventional methods had been exhausted and a covert operation was the last option to infiltrate the criminal network. Dibley told the Evening Echo, quote, "When you have no evidence, you have no choice." In my own judgment, Sentry was never realistically a last option. It was simply down to Dibley, whose weight and influence in Essex CID was permitted to prevail and become the governing influence. Remember that Sentry was targeted at only Sarah Saunders and Michael Steele. That its purpose was also to frighten and threaten Womes. But that is Dibley after the event, getting carried away. Like Steele, Womes wasn't arrested until mid-May 1996, and nothing in the information I've seen points to Womes being on the receiving end of Operation Sentry. The idea behind Operation Sentry was to get a meet with Steele or Saunders, or to use Saunders to get to Steele, and hopefully they would incriminate themselves in the Rettendon murders. Whether a meet, if it had ever happened, would have assisted the police in any way is extremely doubtful. Firstly, in relation to Steele and Saunders, especially Saunders, given that she was the mother of Tate's young son, what conventional methods had been tried and failed? The Home Office police strategy implies that she was beyond reach of that for unstated reasons. According to Steele, before his arrest in mid-May 1996 on a drugs-related matter, there was no attempt made in any shape or form by Dibley's Rettendon investigators to contact him in connection with their inquiries. Maybe conventional police methods mean something very obscure, and given that Dibley has claimed that Steele was one of his main suspects from day one, you wonder, Sentry or no Sentry, what was really going on. It's a nonsense that Operation Sentry was the only option. And if it were, its practitioners were not entitled to ignore the suspect's human rights and make criminal threats against them. This is in fact the truly fundamental issue at the very heart of Operation Sentry. Consider too the means by which this case was finally laid against Steele and Womes. An associate of Steele's, Darren Nichols, gets into really big police trouble, and under arrest he requested to see a senior officer about another matter. It is there that he confessed to his involvement in the Rettendon murders, to simply help himself. After the Rettendon trial convictions, Detective Superintendent Brian Story told the press that he could not comment on Nichols' evidence. A touch unusual. In the silence I thought I heard a bent pin drop. I like to call Darren Nichols Dibley's driver, and I am rather curious about the way in which Dibley said he had predicted the way the Rettendon case would be cracked. Dibley told the People on the 25th of January 98 that there is a class of crime, a category of crime, a type of crime of which Rettendon was one, in which major criminals behave in a predictable way. He continued that with a crime like Rettendon, which was typical of others he had in mind, the killers would not have driven themselves away from the scene after doing what they had. I'm sceptical, but Dibley said proudly that all he had therefore needed was a body to put his hands up to being the Rettendon driver, and lo and behold, that was exactly what came about. Nichols had unwittingly been the driver on the night. He hadn't seen the killings occur, but Steele and Womes had made numerous incriminating comments afterwards. The police had their case. Nichols would do very little porridge, and now he's using the alias Bertie Smalls. We didn't need Operation Sentry after all. Should we all claim a refund? A chauffeur from Essex Police. Okay, so a really, really interesting and thought-provoking piece there by Ian Cameron. This guy has obviously gone into a lot of detail. He's gone to a lot of trouble over the years in order to gain the information that he has, even going so far as to contact Michael Steele himself. So what are my thoughts on this piece and the investigation in general? The first thing I want to mention is that it's quite interesting to read what he has written at the end here. Now, bearing in mind that this article was written some years ago, and I've actually only read it around a couple of hours before making this video. But it's interesting that he mentions the same things that I have made countless videos on. The fact that Ivan Dibley supposedly knew who was responsible for this crime just 48 hours after it was committed. Yet they had to go to this massive undercover operation, basically breaching policing standards in order to try and gain credible evidence against those suspects. If Ivan Dibley was so sure, if he really knew who he was looking for, merely 48 hours after this crime was committed, then why did they need to go to such dangerous lengths in order to gather the evidence and information that was required for a conviction? Operation Sentry is one which at the heart of it appears to, at the very least, potentially breach policing conduct rules. And not just on one occasion, but multiple occasions. This undercover operation not only threatened Michael Steele, but also in some ways attacked someone who had just lost their long-term partner. She'd been left with a 2-year-old child. She was actually called into the police station and was really being questioned in the form of a suspect, not someone who had lost someone who was at one time very close to them. It makes you wonder exactly how far the police went in order to capture Michael Steele. We have Ivan Dibley in the newspaper articles that I have made videos about on this channel coming out stating that within 48 hours I knew who was responsible for this crime. We have no forensic evidence, we have no footprints, we have no DNA evidence, we have no eyewitness accounts. But I am sure that I knew who it was. It was quite easy to tell. We had Donna Jaggers coming forward saying that they were meeting Mickey the pilot that evening. Lo and behold, I was in the canteen one day and I said to one of my officers, "Do you know of a Mickey the pilot?" "Oh, I do actually, Michael Steele. Yes, let's go and dig up some information on him." How far did they go in order to lay a case on Michael Steele? What tactics were used? Were other breaches made in this investigation? It is also interesting to combine those newspaper articles which portray a confident and effervescent character in Detective Ivan Dibley, who apparently has single-handedly solved a triple murder within the first 48 hours of its occurrence, with the necessity for this actual operation. The whole point of Operation Sentry was, as they put it, because they had run out of ideas. They had no evidence to convict the person or persons responsible for this murder. So which one was it? Was it someone who knew exactly who had committed this crime? Or was it the fact that they had to actually resort to underhanded policing tactics and an undercover operation where people were actually threatened in order to gain credible evidence? It can't be both. Now, obviously, there is a great deal of difference between having a strong suspicion and having enough credible evidence to convict someone in a court of law. But quite simply, Michael Steele was never questioned. We have Donna Jaggers, who was Craig Rolfe's long-term partner, who told detectives that they were going to meet Michael Steele that evening. Yet Michael Steele was not once called in for questioning regarding his whereabouts on December the 6th. Michael Steele's name would have been one of the first that would have supposedly have come out in this investigation. Yet he isn't approached for his whereabouts. He isn't even questioned regarding these murders until sometime during 1996. We also have the fact that Operation Sentry was supposedly supposed to focus on Wholmes and Steele. Yet it actually focused on Steele and Saunders. Is this a sign that they really wanted Michael Steele put behind bars? The Leah Betts situation, the mainstream media influx and the pressure on the Essex police during this time was immense. Michael Steele was someone who had evaded capture and really had stuck two fingers up at customs and the police for many, many years. It's funny how Jack Wholmes doesn't actually appear anywhere in Operation Sentry. It was solely focused really on Michael Steele, on gaining some credible evidence to put this man, this long-time drug importer, behind bars. If you would like to learn more about the Range Rover murders, then click on the video in front of you now. You will also see the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. Many thanks for joining me for this video. I look forward to seeing you all again for the next one. Take care. Cheers.